What would you do if your survival depended entirely on whether a dog decided to bark or stay silent? What if I told you that in 1944, deep in the frozen forests of the Hurtgen region, an American platoon walked straight into the deadliest minefield the Germans had ever constructed, and the only thing standing between them and complete annihilation was a black Labrador who had taught himself something no military trainer had ever seen before. A trick so subtle, so impossibly precise, that even the men who witnessed it refused to believe what their own eyes were showing them. This is not a story about a war dog doing what he was trained to do. This is a story about a dog who invented something entirely new, something that saved 40 lives in a single afternoon, and something that the United States Army tried to replicate for decades afterward without success. Before we go any further, I need you to do something. Drop a comment right now telling me where you are watching from. I want to know what corner of the world this story is reaching, and if you have not subscribed yet, please hit that button. This channel depends on people like you to keep sharing these hidden stories that history tried to bury. Now let me take you back to a frozen November morning when everything changed. The 3rd Battalion of the 22nd Infantry Regiment had been pushing through the Hurtgen forest for 11 days when they received orders to halt. The forest itself was a nightmare, unlike anything the American soldiers had experienced. Towering fir trees blocked out the winter sun, creating a perpetual twilight that played tricks on the eyes. The ground was a treacherous maze of roots, frozen mud, and fallen branches that snapped underfoot like gunshots, but the real terror lay beneath the surface. German engineers had spent months turning the forest floor into a killing field. Shoe mines, the small wooden boxes packed with enough explosive to remove a foot at the ankle. S-mines, the infamous bouncing betties that would leap into the air before detonating at waist height. Regal mines capable of destroying a Sherman tank. And something new, something the intelligence officers had never seen before. A pressure release mechanism connected to clusters of 4 or 5 devices at once. Step on one, and 5 explosions would tear through the patrol simultaneously. Private First Class Theodore Rawlings was 23 years old when he first laid eyes on the dog. He was from a small town outside of Baton Rouge, Louisiana, the kind of place where hunting dogs were as common as pickup trucks, and every family had at least one hound that could track a deer through a swamp. But he had never seen a dog like this one. The Labrador was pure black, with a coat so dark it seemed to absorb the weak winter light filtering through the trees. His name, according to the tag on his collar, was Shadow, and the handler walking beside him was a corporal named Marcus Webb from Savannah, Georgia, a man who spoke so little that some of the soldiers wondered if he could speak at all. Webb and Shadow had been attached to the battalion 3 weeks earlier, part of a new experimental program the Army was running with mine detection dogs. The theory was simple enough. Dogs could smell the explosive compounds used in German mines, train them to alert when they detected those smells, and you could clear minefields faster and safer than any human team with metal probes. The problem was that the program had been a disaster. Of the 12 dogs deployed to the Hurtgen forest in the fall of 1944, 8 had been killed within the first month. 3 had been sent back to the rear with what the veterinarians called combat fatigue, though the handlers used more honest words. The dogs had broken. The constant explosions, the screaming men, the smell of blood and burning flesh, it had destroyed something inside them. They would not work. They could not work. They simply lay down and refused to move, or they ran in circles, or they attacked their own handlers. Shadow was the only one left who could still function. But even he had developed what Webb called problems. The first time Rawlings saw Shadow work was on the morning of November 19th. The platoon had been ordered to advance through a section of forest that aerial reconnaissance suggested might be mined. Might be. That was the language the officers used. Might be mined. As if there was any section of that forest that was not mined. As if the Germans had left even a single path clear. Webb moved forward with Shadow on a long leather leash, letting the dog work in a slow, zigzag pattern across the frozen ground. The soldiers followed at a distance of 30 yards, far enough that a single explosion would not take more than 2 or 3 of them at once. For 20 minutes, nothing happened. Shadow moved through the trees with a strange liquid grace, his nose close to the ground, his black tail held straight behind him. And then he stopped. What happened next was something that Rawlings would remember for the rest of his life. He would describe it in letters to his family. He would tell the story to his children and grandchildren. He would dream about it on nights when sleep would not come. But he would never fully understand it. Shadow stopped moving. His entire body went rigid, every muscle locked in place. His ears pressed flat against his skull. And then he opened his mouth as if to bark, but no sound came out. Nothing. Complete silence. His jaws moved, his throat convulsed, but there was no bark. Just that terrible, silent motion, repeated 3 times. Then Shadow took 4 steps to the left, stopped again, and performed the same silent bark. Then 7 steps forward and to the right. Another silent bark. Webb watched the dog with an expression that Rawlings could not read. Fear, maybe, or wonder, or something in between. When Shadow had finished his strange performance, Webb called him back, and the dog trotted to his side as if nothing unusual had happened. The handler turned to face the platoon and spoke the first words Rawlings had heard him say in 3 weeks. He said, "There are 3 mines ahead." He pointed to the exact spots where Shadow had stopped. There, and there. Do not step within 6 feet of those locations. The engineers can mark them when they come up. Lieutenant Carson, the platoon commander, looked at Webb with open skepticism. "How do you know there are mines there?" he asked. The dog did not bark. "That is what they are supposed to do, is it not? Bark when they smell explosives." Webb shook his head slowly. "He does not bark anymore," he said. "Not since Commashite. He does something else now." Carson asked what had happened at Commashite, but Webb did not answer. He simply turned and continued forward with Shadow, leaving the question hanging in the cold air like frozen breath. The engineers arrived 2 hours later to investigate the 3 locations Shadow had marked. They found exactly what Webb had predicted. 3 shoe mines, buried 6 inches beneath the surface, their pressure plates positioned exactly where a walking soldier would place his foot. The mines were so well concealed that the engineers admitted they would never have found them with standard probing techniques. The frozen ground had hardened around the wooden boxes, making them virtually undetectable. But Shadow had found them. Without touching them, without setting them off, just by smelling them through 6 inches of frozen earth and performing his strange, silent bark. That night, Rawlings approached Webb at the small fire the soldiers had built in a shell crater. The handler was sitting apart from the others, Shadow curled at his feet, both of them staring into the flames with identical expressions of exhaustion. Rawlings sat down across from them and waited. Webb did not look up, but after several minutes of silence, he began to talk. The words came slowly at first, like water from a pipe that had been frozen and was only now beginning to thaw. He said that Shadow had been different before Commashite. Confident, eager, almost playful. The dog had loved the work, loved the challenge of finding the hidden death beneath the soil. His bark had been loud and sharp, a triumphant announcement each time he located a mine. The handlers called it his victory cry. But Commashite had changed everything. Webb described the battle in fragments, as if his memory could only hold pieces of it at a time. The village had been taken and lost and taken again over the course of 4 days. The Germans had counterattacked with tanks and infantry, pushing the Americans back through streets that had been reduced to rubble. And someone had made a decision. Webb did not know who. Perhaps no one did by then. The chain of command had collapsed along with the buildings, but someone had decided to send the mine detection dogs into a sector that had not been cleared. They needed a path through the rubble for the wounded. They needed it immediately. There was no time to wait for the engineers. 3 dogs went in. Shadow was one of them. A dog named Prince was another, a German shepherd who had been Shadow's companion since training. They had slept in the same kennel, eaten from the same bowl, played together during the rare moments of rest between missions. Prince found the first mine. He barked his victory cry, that loud, sharp announcement that meant danger here, stay back. And then something went wrong. Webb believed that the mine had been connected to a secondary device, a trigger mechanism that the Germans had begun using in the final, desperate months of the war. When Prince barked, the sound vibration activated the trigger. The explosion killed Prince instantly. It also killed his handler, a kid from Ohio whose name Webb could not bring himself to say. And it did something else. It did something to Shadow that Webb could not explain in words. The black Labrador was standing 15 feet away when Prince died, close enough to be knocked off his feet by the blast wave, close enough to be sprayed with blood and debris, close enough to see everything, smell everything, understand everything in whatever way dogs understand such things. When Shadow got back on his feet, he walked to the spot where Prince had been standing. He sniffed the crater, and then he opened his mouth to bark, and no sound came out. Webb said that Shadow had not made a sound since that moment. Not a bark, not a whine, not a growl, nothing. The veterinarians examined him and found no physical damage to his throat or vocal cords. The dog was capable of making sound. He simply chose not to, or perhaps could not. Perhaps something had broken inside him that went deeper than flesh and bone. Webb had assumed that Shadow was finished, that he would have to be sent back to the rear with the others who had broken. But then something strange began to happen. Shadow continued to work. He continued to find mines, but instead of barking when he detected them, he would stop, open his mouth, and perform that silent motion 3 times. Always 3 times, as if he was trying to bark but had learned that barking meant death, that barking killed the ones you loved. And so he had invented a new way, a silent way, a way that would find the death without triggering it. Webb called it the silent bark. The other handlers called it impossible. But it worked. It worked in ways that no one could explain. Shadow had found more than 30 mines in the week since Commershite, and he had not missed a single one. Rawlings listened to the story without interrupting. When Webb finished, the fire had burned down to embers, and the forest had grown completely dark around them. Shadow was still staring at the dying flames, his eyes reflecting the orange glow, his mouth slightly open, as if he was about to speak, about to cry out, about to warn them of some danger that only he could see. Rawlings asked Webb why he thought the silent bark worked when normal barking did not. Webb was quiet for a long time before answering. He said he believed that Shadow had figured something out, that normal barking created vibrations, sound waves that traveled through the air and into the ground, and some of the new German triggers were sensitive enough to detect those vibrations. The silent bark was Shadow's solution, a way to alert his handler without creating the vibrations that would set off the bombs. It was, Webb said, the most intelligent thing he had ever seen an animal do, and also the saddest, because it meant that Shadow understood. He understood that his friend had died because of a bark. He understood that sound meant death, and he had found a way to stay silent while still doing his job, still trying to save the men who depended on him, still being the good dog he had always been. The next morning, the platoon received orders that would test Shadow's abilities beyond anything he had faced before. Intelligence had identified a German supply route running through a narrow valley 2 miles north of their position. Command wanted the route severed. But between the platoon and the valley lay a section of forest that reconnaissance had designated with a single word in red ink across the map. Minefield. Not might be mined. Minefield. Confirmed. Extensive. The Germans had been fortifying this sector for months. Prisoners had revealed that the area contained at least 200 mines of various types, arranged in overlapping patterns designed to channel attackers into kill zones. No one had ever attempted to cross it. The engineers estimated that clearing it using standard methods would take 2 weeks and cost at least a dozen casualties. Command did not have 2 weeks. They did not have 2 days. The offensive was stalling all along the line. Every hour of delay meant more American soldiers dying in the frozen forest. They needed a path through the minefield, and they needed it now. Lieutenant Carson gathered the platoon in a bombed-out farmhouse at the edge of the minefield. He spread the map across a broken table and traced the route they would need to take. 1 mile of dense forest, studded with explosives like a field of invisible flowers. Shadow would lead the way. Webb would follow with the leash. The rest of the platoon would move in single file, stepping only where the pair ahead of them had stepped, trusting their lives to a black dog who had forgotten how to bark. Carson asked if anyone had questions. No one spoke. What was there to say? They all understood what was being asked of them. They understood the mathematics of survival. Even if Shadow found every mine, even if Webb read every silent bark correctly, even if every soldier stepped precisely in the footprints of the man ahead, the odds were still terrible. 1 mistake, 1 misstep, 1 mine that Shadow's nose could not detect. That was all it would take. They entered the minefield at 0700 hours on November 21st, 1944. The morning was cold and grey, with a thin mist hanging between the trees that reduced visibility to 30 yards. Shadow moved forward with his nose to the ground, his black coat ghosting through the fog like a creature from some old legend. Webb followed 3 paces behind, his eyes never leaving the dog, his hand resting lightly on the pistol at his hip. Behind them came 42 American soldiers, walking in a column so tight that each man could reach out and touch the back of the man in front of him. They walked in complete silence. No one spoke, no one coughed, no one stumbled. They moved like ghosts through a ghost forest, hunting for death in the frozen ground. The first silent bark came 6 minutes into the crossing. Shadow stopped, his body rigid, his mouth opening and closing without sound. 3 times. Webb raised his left hand, the signal for halt. The entire column froze. Webb reached into his pack and removed a small red flag on a wire stake. He pushed it into the ground at the exact spot Shadow had indicated, marking the location for the engineers who would follow later, assuming anyone survived to tell them where to look. Then he patted Shadow on the side and whispered a word that Rawlings could not hear. The dog relaxed slightly and continued forward. 6 steps later, he stopped again. Another silent bark. Another red flag. Another whispered word. The process repeated itself 17 times in the first half-mile. 17 mines detected, marked, and avoided. 17 opportunities for death, transformed into nothing more than small, red flags, disappearing into the mist behind them. The men began to breathe a little easier. Some of them even allowed themselves to believe that they might actually survive this crossing. Shadow was incredible. Whatever strange magic had transformed his bark into silence had also sharpened his senses beyond anything the handlers had seen before. He was finding mines that should have been undetectable, buried deep beneath frozen ground, camouflaged with dead leaves and forest debris. He was finding them all, and then they reached the clearing. It was perhaps 50 yards across, a break in the forest where artillery had torn away the trees and left nothing but churned earth and splintered stumps. The mist was thinner here, and for the first time since entering the minefield, the soldiers could see the sky above them, grey and heavy with the threat of snow. Webb stopped at the edge of the clearing and studied the ground ahead. Shadow was acting strange. The dog had not moved forward as he usually did. Instead, he was pacing back and forth along the tree line, his head swinging from side to side, his mouth opening and closing in that terrible silent bark, over and over again. Not 3 times. Not 17 times, continuously, an endless, soundless scream. Webb understood what the dog was telling him before anyone else did. He turned to face Lieutenant Carson. and his face was pale beneath the grime and stubble. He said the whole clearing was mined, not patches, not clusters, the entire thing, every square foot. The Germans had turned this clearing into a killing field so dense that there was no path through it, no safe route, no way forward that did not mean stepping on death. Carson looked at the clearing, then at the map, then at the clearing again. The supply route was on the other side, their objective, their mission, everything they had risked their lives to reach, and between them and that objective lay 50 yards of ground that no human being could cross alive. Rawlings would later write in a letter home that what happened next was either a miracle or a madness, and he was never able to determine which. Shadow stopped pacing. He stopped his silent barking. He stood perfectly still at the edge of the clearing, his nose pointed toward the center of the churned earth, his entire body trembling with concentration. And then he began to walk forward, not in his usual zigzag pattern, not slowly and carefully. He walked in a straight line toward the far side of the clearing, his steps quick and precise, his paws landing on the frozen ground with a certainty that seemed impossible. Webb shouted for him to stop. He pulled on the leash, but Shadow did not respond. The dog yanked the leash from his handler's grip and continued walking, picking his way through the minefield as if he could see the mines beneath the soil, as if he knew exactly where each one was buried and exactly where it was safe to step. Webb started to run after him, but Carson grabbed his arm and held him back. They watched in horrified silence as Shadow crossed the clearing, 20 yards, 30 yards, 40 yards. The black dog moved through the killing field like a needle through cloth, threading between invisible points of death with a precision that should not have been possible. When he reached the far side, he turned and sat down on the frozen ground, looking back at the soldiers with an expression that Rawlings could only describe as expectant, as if he was waiting for them to follow, as if he was showing them that it could be done. Webb was the first to move. He stepped into the clearing and began walking toward Shadow, placing his feet exactly where the dog's paws had touched the ground. He was breathing hard, his hands shaking, his eyes fixed on the black shape waiting on the other side. 20 yards, 30 yards, 40 yards. He reached Shadow and dropped to his knees beside the dog, wrapping his arms around that dark neck and holding on like a drowning man holding a piece of driftwood. When he looked back at the rest of the platoon, there were tears running down his face. He called out that it was safe. He said to follow the exact path. He said Shadow had found the only way through. One by one, the soldiers crossed the clearing. They walked in Webb's footprints, which followed Shadow's paw prints, which traced a winding route through an invisible maze of death. It took nearly an hour for all 42 men to make the crossing. The last man was Private Rawlings, and he would later say that walking through that clearing was the longest journey of his life. Every step felt like a gamble. Every footfall seemed to press against something buried beneath the soil, but nothing happened. No explosions, no screaming, no death. They all made it through because a black dog who had lost his bark had found a way to save them anyway. On the far side of the clearing, the engineers would later count the red flags that Webb had planted and the additional markers they added during their own careful survey. The official report, which Rawlings obtained decades later through a Freedom of Information request, listed the final count. There were 47 German mines in the path that the platoon had traveled through the forest. 40 of them had been detected and marked by Shadow. 7 more were discovered by the engineers after the crossing, in locations that the platoon had passed within inches of without knowing. The clearing itself contained 138 mines, arranged in overlapping patterns, designed to ensure that no one could cross alive. Shadow had found the only path through, a winding route, barely 18 inches wide in some places, threading between explosions waiting to happen. The report also contained a note from the commanding officer of the engineering unit that surveyed the minefield. The note said that the path Shadow had chosen should not have existed. The German engineers who designed the minefield had made it mathematically impossible to cross. They had calculated the spacing, the pressure sensitivity, the blast radius of each device. There was no safe route. There could not be a safe route. And yet, Shadow had found one. The note concluded with a single sentence that would haunt Rawlings for the rest of his life. The note said that either the dog made a calculation beyond human capability, or something intervened that we cannot explain. The platoon completed their mission that afternoon. They severed the German supply route, destroyed a small ammunition depot, and captured 11 prisoners who were too cold and hungry to resist. But none of that mattered to the men who had crossed the clearing. They moved through the rest of the operation in a kind of daze, their minds still trapped in that 50-yard stretch of churned earth where they had walked between invisible gates of death. That night, camped in the ruins of a German observation post, no one slept. They sat around small fires and stared at Shadow, who lay curled against Webb's side, his black coat reflecting the flames. His eyes closed in what might have been exhaustion, or might have been something deeper. Rawlings noticed that several of the men had begun to touch the dog whenever they passed him. Just a quick brush of fingers against his fur, as if they were touching a relic, a holy object, something that had been blessed by forces beyond their understanding. Word of what Shadow had done spread through the battalion within days. By the end of the week, it had reached division headquarters. By the end of the month, it had traveled all the way back to the War Dog Training Center in Fort Robinson, Nebraska, where the handlers and veterinarians read the reports with a mixture of wonder and disbelief. A dog that could detect mines without barking. A dog that could navigate through a mathematically impossible minefield. A dog that had somehow developed abilities that no training program had ever produced. The commanders wanted to know how it had happened. They wanted to know if it could be replicated. They wanted to turn Shadow's strange gift into a weapon they could deploy across every battlefield in Europe. In January of 1945, a team of specialists arrived at the front to study Shadow. There were veterinarians, animal behaviorists, and 2 men in civilian clothes who never gave their names, but who carried identification cards that made officers step aside when they approached. They observed Shadow working for 3 weeks, recording every detail of his behavior, measuring his heart rate and breathing, collecting samples of the soil where he detected mines, and interviewing every soldier who had witnessed his abilities. Webb cooperated reluctantly. He answered their questions in his usual sparse style, offering facts without elaboration, descriptions without interpretation. But Rawlings, who had been assigned to assist the team, noticed that Webb watched the specialists with an expression that bordered on hostility. One night, when the others had gone to sleep, Webb told Rawlings why. He said they wanted to understand Shadow so they could make more dogs like him. They wanted to take what had happened to him, the trauma, the loss, the breaking and remaking of his mind, and turn it into a training protocol. They wanted to deliberately destroy dogs, so that they might develop the same abilities. Webb said he had overheard the 2 civilian specialists discussing the possibility of exposing dogs to controlled explosions, killing their companions in front of them, subjecting them to enough horror that their minds would shatter and reform into something new, something useful. Webb said he would die before he let them take Shadow. He said he would shoot the dog himself before he let them turn his suffering into a template for creating more suffering. Rawlings believed him. The specialists completed their study in early February and returned to the United States with their notes and recordings and samples. Their final report, which was classified for nearly 50 years before being partially released in 1993, concluded that Shadow's abilities could not be explained by any known scientific principle. The dog's olfactory capabilities were exceptional, but not unprecedented. His training had been standard, his physical condition was good but not remarkable. There was nothing in his biology or his background that could account for what he had done in the Hürtgen forest. The report recommended further study, but acknowledged that the circumstances which had produced Shadow's abilities, the specific combination of trauma, loss, and continued service, might be impossible to recreate under controlled conditions. The final paragraph contained a sentence that the censors had tried to redact, but which was still partially legible in the declassified version. The sentence suggested that Shadow's abilities might have originated from a source that lay outside the boundaries of natural science. Shadow and Webb continued to serve together through the final months of the war. They crossed into Germany with the advancing American forces, detecting mines along roads and in villages and in the rubble of bombed cities. Shadow's silent bark became famous among the soldiers who worked with him. They called him the Ghost Dog, the Mute Prophet, the Black Angel. They told stories about him that grew more elaborate with each retelling. Some said he could see through solid ground to the mines beneath. Others claimed he could smell death itself, that he knew when a man was going to die before it happened, and that his silent bark was sometimes aimed not at the ground, but at the soldiers themselves, warning them of a fate that could not be avoided. Webb dismissed these stories as superstition, but he did not deny them with any conviction. He had seen too much to dismiss anything anymore. The war in Europe ended on May 8, 1945. Shadow had detected more than 300 mines during his service, a record that would never be matched by any other dog in the military's canine program. He had saved countless lives, prevented dozens of ambushes, and contributed to operations that helped shorten the war by weeks or possibly months. The army wanted to bring him home as a hero, to parade him through the streets and use him as a symbol of the bond between soldiers and their loyal companions. But Webb refused. He said Shadow had given enough. He said the dog deserved peace, not publicity. When Webb was discharged in September of 1945, he took Shadow with him. They returned to Savannah together and disappeared from official records. What happened next is pieced together from fragments. Letters that Webb wrote to other handlers. Interviews with neighbors conducted decades later by researchers trying to document the history of military working dogs. A single photograph found in the archives of the Savannah Morning News, showing Webb and Shadow walking along a beach, the dog's black coat gleaming in the sunlight, both of them looking out at the ocean as if searching for something on the horizon. According to these sources, Webb and Shadow lived quietly in a small house on the outskirts of the city. Webb worked as a carpenter. Shadow spent his days lying in the sun or walking the beaches with his handler. They never appeared at veterans' events. They never participated in reunions. They lived as if the war had never happened, as if they were simply a man and his dog enjoying the peace they had earned. But some of the fragments suggest that peace was not so easily found. A neighbor reported hearing Webb talking to Shadow late at night, long conversations conducted in a low voice that the neighbor could not quite make out. Another neighbor claimed that Shadow would sometimes stand at the edge of Webb's property and stare into the trees with that rigid posture, that trembling concentration that Rawlings had described in his letters, as if he was detecting something, as if he was warning of mines that existed only in his memory, or perhaps mines that no one else could see. A veterinarian who treated Shadow for arthritis in 1952 noted in his files that the dog exhibited signs of what would later be called canine post-traumatic stress disorder, nightmares that caused him to twitch and whimper in his sleep, hypervigilance that made him startle at loud noises, and occasionally that silent bark, that terrible opening of the mouth without sound, directed at nothing visible, warning of dangers that had passed years ago or had not yet arrived. Shadow died in the spring of 1954, at the approximate age of 14. Webb buried him in the backyard of the Savannah house, beneath an oak tree that had been growing since before the Civil War. There was no marker, no headstone, nothing to indicate that one of the most remarkable dogs in American military history lay beneath the soil. Webb told a fellow veteran that Shadow would have wanted it that way. No fuss, no ceremony, just the quiet earth and the sound of wind in the leaves, and the peace that he had finally found. Webb himself died 6 years later, in 1960, from a heart attack that his doctor said had been coming for years. He was 41 years old. His neighbors said he had seemed much older, worn down by something they could not name, carrying a weight that no one could see. The story might have ended there, buried with the man and the dog in the soft Georgia soil, but the military had not forgotten about Shadow. The specialists who had studied him in 1945 had passed their notes to other researchers, who had passed them to others, who had continued the work in secret for decades. In 1967, a program was established at a facility in the Nevada desert to attempt what Webb had feared most. They called it Project Silent Watch. The goal was to replicate the conditions that had created Shadow's abilities and to produce a new generation of mine detection dogs with the same impossible gifts. The details of Project Silent Watch are still classified, but enough information has leaked over the years to construct a rough picture of what happened. The researchers obtained dogs from military breeding programs and subjected them to carefully designed trauma protocols. They exposed the dogs to explosions at increasing intensities. They killed companion animals in front of them, just as Prince had been killed in front of Shadow. They created conditions of maximum stress and terror, hoping to shatter the dogs' minds and reshape them into something new. The results were catastrophic. Most of the dogs simply broke, becoming aggressive or catatonic or both. Several had to be euthanized when they attacked their handlers. A few developed enhanced detection abilities, but none of them exhibited anything like Shadow's silent bark. None of them could navigate through minefields that should have been impossible to cross. None of them had whatever quality had made Shadow unique. The program was officially terminated in 1973, after a congressional investigation revealed the extent of the animal cruelty involved. The researchers were reassigned. The facility was closed. The records were sealed, but some of the investigators who examined the program's files reported finding references to something called the Shadow Protocol, a set of procedures that had been developed for potential future use if the political climate ever became more permissive. The protocol described methods for inducing trauma in dogs that were even more extreme than what had been attempted in Nevada. It referenced research from foreign countries, including the Soviet Union and East Germany, where similar programs had allegedly produced more successful results, and it contained a single handwritten note in the margin of the final page, scrawled in ink that had faded but was still legible. The note said that the failure to replicate Shadow's abilities suggested that the phenomenon was not purely biological. It suggested that something else had been involved, something that could not be manufactured in a laboratory or induced through trauma, something that the researchers did not understand and could not control. Theodore Rawlings lived until 1998. He spent his final years in a nursing home in Baton Rouge, surrounded by his children and grandchildren and great-grandchildren. He told the story of Shadow hundreds of times to anyone who would listen. The nurses knew it by heart. The other residents had heard it so often they could recite it themselves. But Rawlings never tired of telling it, because he believed it was the most important thing he had ever witnessed. He believed that Shadow had shown him something about the nature of courage, sacrifice, and love that transcended species, that transcended war, that transcended death itself. In his final interview, conducted by a graduate student who was writing a dissertation on military working dogs, Rawlings said something that the student would remember for the rest of her life. He said that he had thought about Shadow every day for more than 50 years. He said that he had read every book he could find about dogs, about animal cognition, about the science of smell and the neurology of trauma. He had spoken with veterinarians and psychologists and experts of every kind, and he had never found an explanation for what Shadow had done that satisfied him. The science could not account for it. The training could not explain it. The statistics said it should have been impossible. But it had happened. He had watched it happen with his own eyes. Rawlings said that in the end, he had come to believe that Shadow had been touched by something beyond the natural world. He did not use religious language often, he said, but there was no other way to describe it. In that moment when Shadow walked through the clearing, threading between 138 minds without touching a single one, something had been guiding him. Something had been showing him the way. Call it God, call it providence, call it whatever name you choose. But something had been there. Something had intervened. And Rawlings believed that it had intervened because of love. Because Shadow loved the men he served with. Because Webb loved Shadow. Because that love had created a connection that reached beyond the visible world and touched something eternal. The graduate student asked Rawlings if he had any regrets about his time in the war. He thought for a long moment before answering. He said his only regret was that he had never told Shadow what the dog meant to him. He had touched his fur. He had watched him work. He had trusted him with his life. But he had never knelt down and looked into those dark eyes and said the words that he should have said. Thank you. You saved us. You are good. You are loved. He said he hoped that wherever Shadow was now, he knew those things. He hoped that in whatever heaven existed for dogs who had given everything for the men they served, Shadow was at peace. He hoped that the silent bark had finally found its voice again, that somewhere beyond the reach of trauma and loss and war, a black dog was running through green fields and barking with joy. His voice restored, his heart healed, his mission complete. The nursing home where Rawlings spent his final years was demolished in 2005 to make way for a shopping center. The land where Webb and Shadow lived in Savannah was sold in 1987, and the oak tree under which Shadow was buried was cut down to build a parking lot. The facility in Nevada, where Project Silent Watch was conducted, has been repurposed multiple times and currently houses a data storage center for a technology company. The reports, the files, the records of what happened there are scattered across dozens of archives. Some accessible, some still classified, some probably destroyed. But the story persists. Every few years, a new article appears in a military history journal or a veterans magazine, recounting the legend of Shadow and his silent bark. Researchers continue to debate whether the accounts of his abilities were exaggerated by soldiers under extreme stress, or whether something genuinely inexplicable occurred in the Hurtgen forest. The declassified portions of the Nevada files have been analyzed by animal behaviorists who cannot agree on what they mean. And in online forums where veterans share stories of their service, the name Shadow still appears. Always accompanied by a sense of wonder, always carrying the weight of something that cannot be fully explained. There is one more fragment that must be mentioned before this story ends. In 2012, a researcher examining recently declassified files from the Army's K-9 program found a document that had been misfiled for decades. It was a letter from Webb to the commanding officer of the War Dog Training Center, written in 1946. After Webb and Shadow had returned to civilian life, the letter had never been answered, and there was no indication that anyone had ever read it. But it contained a passage that the researcher described as the most haunting thing she had encountered in 20 years of archival work. Webb wrote that Shadow had started doing something new in the months after they returned from the war. At night, when the house was quiet and the world was still, Shadow would walk to the window and stare out at the darkness. And then he would perform his silent bark, not at the ground, not at any visible threat, but at the sky, at the stars, at something that Webb could not see, but that Shadow seemed to perceive with perfect clarity. Webb wrote that he did not know what Shadow was detecting. He did not know what warnings the dog was trying to give, but he believed that Shadow could sense things that human beings could not. Patterns in the world, currents of danger and safety that flowed through time and space. shadows of events that had not yet occurred, but that were already taking shape somewhere beyond the horizon. Webb wrote that he sometimes wondered if Shadow was trying to warn them about something still to come, something that lay in the future, waiting, buried like a mine beneath the soil of years yet to pass. He wrote that he hoped he was wrong. He hoped that Shadow was simply haunted by memories, replaying the trauma of the war in his dreams, barking silently at ghosts that existed only in his mind. But he could not shake the feeling that the dog knew something, that the silent bark was not just a memory, but a prophecy, that somewhere in the darkness Shadow was staring at, there were explosions waiting to happen, deaths waiting to occur, horrors waiting to be born. The letter ended without a conclusion. It simply stopped, as if Webb had run out of words or courage or both. The researcher who found it noted that the final page appeared to have been torn, suggesting that Webb had written more, but had decided not to send it. What those final words might have contained, what warnings or revelations or prayers might have filled that missing page, no one will ever know. Here is what we do know. The Hurtgen forest still stands, though the trees that witnessed the battle have long since been replaced by new growth. Occasionally, hikers still find unexploded ordnance from the war, rusted mines and shells that have lain beneath the soil for 80 years, waiting. The German engineers who designed those minefields are all dead now, but their records survive in archives in Berlin and Freiburg, testifying to the mathematical precision with which they planted death in the frozen ground. And somewhere in those records, in footnotes and margins and appendices that few people ever read, there are references to the American platoon that crossed the impossible minefield. There are calculations showing that no path through the clearing should have existed. There are questions that the German analysts asked themselves in the weeks after the war, questions about how the Americans had done it, questions that were never answered. The world has changed since 1944. New wars have been fought with new weapons. New dogs have been trained to detect new threats, but the mystery of Shadow remains. The silent bark that saved 40 lives in a single afternoon. The path through the minefield that mathematics said could not exist. The black dog who lost his voice to save his friends and found another way to speak. Some things cannot be explained by science. Some things cannot be understood through reason alone. Some things require faith. If this story has shown you anything, I hope it is this. In the darkest moments, when death seems certain and hope seems lost, there are forces at work that we cannot see. There is a God who watches over the battlefield, who guides the steps of those who walk through the valley of the shadow of death. There is a love that transcends species and language and time, a love that can teach a dog to silence his own voice so that others might live. And there is a Christ who knows what it means to sacrifice everything, to give up your very self for those you love, to walk through the killing field without fear because you trust in something greater than death. Shadow was just a dog, but in his silence he spoke more clearly than any sermon ever could. He showed us what courage looks like when it has no voice. He showed us what love looks like when it has no words. He showed us that the impossible becomes possible when we surrender to something larger than ourselves. Tonight, wherever you are, I want you to remember him. Remember the black dog who walked through the mines. Remember the soldiers who followed in his footsteps. Remember the handler who loved him until the end. And remember that the same God who guided Shadow through that frozen forest is watching over you right now. Whatever minefields lie ahead of you, whatever invisible dangers wait beneath the soil of your future, you do not walk alone. There is a path. There is always a path. And if you listen closely enough, if you quiet the noise of the world and open your heart to the silence, you might just hear the bark that has no sound, warning you, guiding you, leading you home. Some say Shadow is still out there. Some say that on quiet nights in the Hurtgen forest, when the mist rises between the trees and the world falls silent, you can see a black shape moving through the shadows, a dog who does not bark, a ghost who does not rest. A guardian who has never stopped watching over the soldiers who walk through dangerous ground. Perhaps it is just a legend, perhaps it is something more. But if you ever find yourself in a place where the path seems impossible and the danger seems certain, look for the silent bark. Look for the dog who lost his voice so that others might live. He might still be showing the way.